In this lesson, we're going to look at how the coming of war changed life in Germany. Germany obviously at war from September of 1939 to the middle of 1945. Well, how did the coming of war change life? In the early period of the war, 1939 to 1942, actually very little did change for most Germans within Germany itself. Many disliked the war with Britain and France, but the stunning military successes in Poland, France, the Low Countries and so on basically stifled doubt. It seemed that the war was going very, very well and life was little affected. After 1942, however, there's a very significant defeat in Stalingrad in Russia in January of 1942. The entire Sixth Army is lost alongside General Paulus. And after that, despite some successes in mid-1942, generally the tide of war turns against the Germans and it begins to have a major impact on life in Germany itself. So some questions you should be answering and making notes on if you're a GCSE student. Who suffered during the war years and why? Well, let's look now at war and the economy. This is a question that sometimes comes up, so again, if you're a GCSE student, make notes on it. In terms of preparation for conflict, under Goering's four-year plan, it envisaged in 1936 that Germany would be ready for war by 1940. Obviously, war actually broke out earlier than that, in September of 1939. So certainly the economy was partly mobilised and ready for war, but certainly not fully mobilised. Early in the war, however, despite this fact, the economy was little affected. And certainly working in Germany's favour was it was able to exploit the resources of the conquered territories. Territories such as France, Poland, Norway, Denmark and so on. So it exploited those resources. Some examples: payments extracted from France in the form of enforced reparations in 1940, 1.75 billion Reichsmarks, and in 1941, 5 billion. So exploiting the resources of the conquered territories as well as raw materials helped the German economy, in addition to slave labour as well. However, by 1942, as we've already said, the tide of war begins to turn against Germany and the German economy. There are now pressures on the German economy from Allied bombing raids. These disrupt the production of factories and transport systems, hampering the German war effort. The Germans are in general able to fairly rapidly and efficiently repair factories and transport systems, but nonetheless it disrupts production and also diverts the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, away from supporting German ground forces, thus limiting the effectiveness of the German army on the ground. Something else which also drained the German economy, and it's weird to look at something which is in essence so horrifying, a great tragedy and a crime in human history, and to reduce it to simple economic factors. Yet the final solution, the deliberate mass murder of Jews, Gypsies and other people in concentration camps and death camps throughout Europe, it was a huge organisational, logistical drain on the German economy. Organising the transport into forced labour camps and death camps. The death camps you can see mostly here are in Poland. This was a drain on the German economy. Railways that could have been used, resources that could have been used in the war effort were diverted into the final solution. Albert Speer, nonetheless, this was a hopeful sign for the Germans, although not enough. He was an architect and he was put in charge of the German economy by Hitler in 1942. Previously, the various ministries in charge of production had been very inefficient as there were lots of overlapping responsibilities in the German government. Hitler had actually kind of encouraged this because he believed in this idea of a sort of Darwinian struggle, that competition and violence would, out of competition and violent struggle, leaders would emerge. But this is not a model for an efficient economy, and ultimately this was realised. Albert Speer was appointed head of armaments production, and he was a very successful and efficient organiser. Armament production, in fact, tripled between 1942 and 1944. Well, despite this huge increase in weapons and armaments production. This did not, of course, enable Germany to win the war. On the Eastern Front, after the Battle of Stalingrad, there were some successes for the Germans at the Battle of Kharkov. But at the Battle of Kursk in 1943, really the German army was smashed in the biggest tank battle ever in history. So the Soviets were advancing from the east. Bombing campaigns, again, are continuing to disrupt, and as the war goes on, these are increasing in intensity, and their disruption of both German manufacturing capacity and, as I've said, diverting the German Air Force to try and intercept bombers instead of being able to support their ground forces against the Russians advancing in from the east. And the Russian hammer from June of 1944 is smashing against the Allied anvil. So the Germans are squashed with a war on two fronts. There's no way the German economy can cope with the production demands that would be required to produce the vast amounts of material resources to fight two enemies on both sides. The United States obviously supporting the efforts of Britain and Canada and so on in the West, as well as the US economy being used through Lend-Lease to aid the Russians. So there's no way the Germans can compete economically with both these armies advancing from the east and the west. So the tide of war turned. The German economy then, of course, at the same time is competing with very, very large enemies with big productive capacity in their industrial economies. It lost the resources then it had gained in the occupied territories as the Allies moved through France and the Soviets moved through Poland and ultimately into Germany. There were shortages, so this is in terms of how civilian life was affected. Shortages of basics such as food and fuel. And heavy air raids, I've already said, disrupted factory production. Well, what were the effects of bombing raids on the civilian population? And apologies for this horrific picture, but unfortunately horror is an aspect of war that people should certainly be aware of before they get into one. In May of 1943, from that time, there was very, very heavy bombing. The British bombed Germany by night and the Americans bombed Germany by day. There were horrific losses, loss of life and destruction within Germany. As an example, in the city of Hamburg, 60% of the city was destroyed, obliterated in a bombing raid. 300,000 houses and between 60 and 100,000 civilians were killed in the raid on Hamburg. This is where we can look at the Second World War in sort of moral terms. The historian Niall Ferguson called it not a war between good and evil, but a war between evil and arguably lesser evil, as undeniably the efforts to destroy German cities, they're aimed at German civilians. Well, what was the effect, though, of the terror bombing on the morale of German civilians? This is a picture, I believe, of, I'm not sure actually which city, but you can see the extent of the devastation. So let's have a look then at the effect of bombing on the civilian population. Survivors recall that people walked around sort of like ghosts, really. They were stressed, they were horrified, there was silence and blank gazes. These are the signs of severe trauma and stress on people. A minority did panic, and when the air raid sirens sounded, some people were trampled to death in efforts to get into overcrowded bomb shelters and bunkers. However, some fought the flames to rescue people that were trapped, and there were many instances of bravery, such as people defusing unexploded bombs. This is similar to the German air raids actually on Britain. It was believed before the Second World War began that bombing raids on large civilian populations would result in the complete collapse of civilian morale and demands to the government to end the war. Well, this did not happen in London. People were horrified by the raids, but carried on and actually developed a sense of solidarity, of comradeship, to share the suffering together. And the same was true in German cities. People suffered from the bombing, but there was not an overall collapse in civilian morale, and certainly it did not lead to an attempt to overthrow the Nazi regime. Let's have a move on and look at the war and German village life. If you recall, in the last lesson we looked at how support for the Third Reich was rather stronger, especially in Protestant northern areas of the German countryside. Well, as the war progressed, this support began to evaporate. From 1939, farmers had to accept refugees and evacuees from the city, both children and adults whose homes had been destroyed. This meant that the population of villages went up, but housing did not, and therefore farmers were often forced to share their homes with refugees from the city. This resulted in many stopping supporting the Third Reich. And even by 1944, as the war is obviously going very badly and defeat is looking inevitable, many farmers actually defied Nazi officials. They did not declare food, for example, food which should be declared and shipped off to the cities, and they even hid deserters. Soldiers who had deserted from the German army were hidden as well. Basically, the Nazis had promised to protect rural life under this whole blood and soil propaganda, but rural life was being destroyed as the war progressed. In terms of rationing, lessons had been learned from the Great War. If you remember back in the end of the First World War, there was widespread starvation throughout Germany from the blockade, and lessons were learned. Shortages never reached critical levels, so although there was widespread hunger, there was not starvation. Food was rationed using ration cards to make sure essentially that supplies didn't run out. There was, however, widespread hunger. An example of that is in 1943, the Berlin Zoo was bombed in a raid, not deliberately. I don't think they were targeting the Berlin Zoo, the bombers, but nonetheless bombs fell on the Berlin Zoo and many of the animals were killed. You can see here a poor old elephant's been killed and scorched in a bombing raid. Well, what happened as soon as it was over is local civilians went in and carved up the meat. The giraffes, the elephants, the wild animals were carved and made into sausages and so on. So that does show you that there is widespread hunger, although not starvation. Furthermore, many goods were traded on the so-called black market. This is where people are illegally trading to avoid rationing and price restrictions. It's obviously very common when the government tries to impose control that goods are then traded on the black market. Evacuation also affected the lives of children and their parents. Children were sent out of the big cities when the bombing campaign started to rural parts of Austria and Bavaria. This was organised by the Hitler Youth, but indeed, of course, as you can imagine yourself, many evacuees suffered from separation from their parents, and parents also missed their children. Women and war, let's have a look again at women. Obviously, half of the population, extremely important. The Allies actually, in Britain, the United States, and especially Russia, were far more successful in mobilising women for the war effort. Are you a girl with a star-spangled heart? Obviously, this sort of propaganda looks a bit obvious to us today with our more sophisticated media, but nonetheless, as I've said, the Allies were far more successful in mobilising women for the war effort. Well, let's look at some of the experiences of German women during the Second World War. Well, they were clearly affected by the war in terms of losses. Women themselves and their female friends were obviously killed in bombing raids, and their menfolk, whether fathers or husbands or sons or lovers or whatever, many were killed on the battlefield. German casualties on the battlefield started to number in the millions, or were killed in bombing raids. If you remember, there was a labour shortage produced by war losses. This obviously was exacerbated, was made worse by the war, and women, you can see a propaganda poster here, were encouraged to go and work in factories to redress this labour shortage. Well, this campaign was not particularly successful, as women were not attracted to work in factories for low pay in poor conditions. Certainly the health of women suffered due to food shortages, the constant stress and worry of bombing raids. You can imagine the sort of stress you'd be under, hearing air raid sirens, living under the fear of death from above constantly, together with the horrible living conditions. In fact, there was a deterioration in public health, not just in women, but children and male adults as well. Resistance did increase during the war, although it's questionable how much it threatened the regime. We'll have a look at more of that. An example of things that people objected to, certainly both Catholic and Protestant priests and members of the public in general. Some protested against the concentration camps, the mass murder and euthanasia, although many were indeed silent and did not openly protest. In 1942, a German Jew here, you can see him pictured, Herbert Baum, set fire to a Nazi exhibition. Well, he was discovered and tortured to death, and 6 others involved were beheaded, and their families sent to the death camp at Auschwitz. The White Rose Group is a very famous group. If you get a chance, you should watch a film on this called Sophie Scholl. Hans and Sophie Scholl and another guy called Christopher Probst, they were young university students at Munich University. And what they did was they produced leaflets criticising German conduct in the war, and they were found on the 18th of February 1943, and they were arrested distributing these leaflets throughout their university. After 3 days of interrogation, they were all executed by guillotine. So in a way, you could say that perhaps they failed, but in another way, their memory certainly lives on. This is the plaza outside Munich University, which is named after the White Rose, sorry again for mispronouncing this, the Geschwister-Scholl Plaza. So in that way, their memory does live on. Their execution didn't end the legacy of what they had tried to achieve. Another very significant operation. By the way, if you're a GCSE student, make notes of these various oppositions to the regime during the war. You should be able to, often the question comes up, what opposition was there to the Nazi regime during the war, and you can make notes on that. So Operation Valkyrie was an attempt by upper-class Germans this time, who perhaps not so much ideologically opposed to Germany, but they felt that he had dragged Germany into an unnecessary war and wanted basically to get rid of Hitler so they could negotiate with the Allies and get Germany out of this disastrous war they felt he had dragged Germany into. And in 1944, there was a conspiracy to kill Hitler. This had some supporters within the German army as well. And what they were hoping to do was assassinate Hitler and then use something which was actually prepared by the Nazi regime, something called Operation Valkyrie, in order to establish a new post-Hitler government and negotiate with the Allies for a surrender. Well, Klaus von Stauffenberg was a key member of the plot, a senior army officer, and what he did was he carried in a briefcase like this, obviously not this briefcase, the briefcase was blown up, but he carried a briefcase containing a bomb. Stauffenberg went to a place called the Wolf's Lair. This is the eastern base of Hitler's operations, where he was overseeing operations on the Eastern Front, operations in Russia and the Soviet Union. And so Klaus von Stauffenberg, he had a valid reason to be there, so he drove to the Wolf's Lair carrying his bomb, knowing that he would meet Hitler in his planning room in the Wolf's Lair. Here you can see a photograph with Mussolini and Hitler in the room in the Wolf's Lair. Well, the bomb was placed under a table in a position where it probably would have killed Hitler, but unfortunately was moved to this other side here, behind a very substantial table leg. So when the bomb did go off after Stauffenberg had left the room, 4 people were killed by the bomb and others were injured, including Hitler, but Hitler himself was not killed. You can see the extent of the damage, but Hitler was not killed. He broadcast a message from his hospital bed, and Operation Valkyrie failed to basically take over the government, which they were trying to do. All members of the plot were executed, along with 5,000 others who were connected with it. Many hung using piano wire. So in summary, in the early phase of the war, German civilians were little affected. In the victorious phase, but certainly as the tide of war turned, people were increasingly affected. The economy, initially, although it wasn't perhaps as ready as it could have been for war, did benefit from resources exploited from the conquered territories. Speer did, in fact, manage to triple arms production between 42 and 44, but this was not enough to cope with the pressures of Allied bombing and the fact that from June of 1944, the Germans were fighting not only the Soviets on the Eastern Front, but Britain and principally the USA on the Western Front as well. Women's lives were clearly affected by the war in a number of ways, including bombing. Bombing, of course, in general affected people's lives, although did not destroy morale, certainly increased the stress and the stressor, that's not a word, increased the pressure and strain on people's lives. Village life, which had previously been a bedrock of Nazi support, began to decline as refugees were housed in villages. And throughout the war, resistance did increase. We need some examples there with Herbert Baum, with the White Rose and Operation Valkyrie. So I hope you made some useful notes there, and good luck with the quiz.